Questions? Very good. Okay, great. Zoom clever. Good morning, guys, on Zoom. Good morning. Good morning. We begin today by thanking the sponsors. For the Yomi, we begin by thanking the Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul. We thank Jerry and Sarah Wolaski for sponsoring all the shiurim for this month, and his chus for the refuah shalema for Zachariah Dov ben Paral Shira. He should have a refuah shalema. We also thank the Tilson and Wall families of Eretz Yisrael for sponsoring all the shiurim this month in honor of our very dear and special Rav and all the simchas and the rest of the kehillah. Mazel tov. And Shana Tova. We also thank Shendi and Avram Kalman for sponsoring these shiurim in the memory of the beloved parents and in the zchus of all those who need a refuah shlema. And we thank Selma Wolf for sponsoring the shiurim in the zchus of refuah shlema for her daughters Susan Rothberg, Tzivya Devara Bas Sarah, and Yomi Amsterdam, Yomi Bas Sarah. Today's daf is Kiddushin daf Yutes, where it has it that we're also going to be learning part of Kiddushin daf Yudches today. So just going to do a quick recap of what the Gemara was talking about yesterday, so like this we can finish it off. The Gemara is analyzing the Kiddushin of Yud. As the pasuk tells us that when a person purchases an Amma Ivriya, one of the rights that comes along with the purchase of Amma Ivriya is the right to marry the girl. So when the father gives over his daughter or sells his daughter as an Amma Ivriya, he's also agreeing at that time that the Adon can marry the Amma Ivriya. Now the question that the Gemara was dealing with is, when the Kiddushin of Yud takes place, when the marriage of Yud takes place, does that accomplish what we know as Kiddushin, which is the equivalent of Erisin, or does that accomplish what we know as Nisuin, which is the final stage of marriage? So is it a full-fledged marriage with nothing else that needs to be done, or is it just the initial stage of Erisin, which is accomplished with Yid, but still there needs to be Nisuin later on, there needs to be a chuppah. So now, just to give some context to understand this, why would it be Erisin? Why would it be just step one? The answer is because it's much more like a financial transaction. Ha'isha niknis, the Kiddushin that we have, is the financial transaction where a person says to his wife, Harayat Mukadeshesli, and gives her something of value. So one would say that that's the same thing of Yud. A person pays money towards the purchase of the Amma Ivriya, towards the purchase of this maidservant. Then that money can then be transferred, instead of being monetary payment for her services as the Amma Ivriya, it could also be transferred as money that's going to be used for Kiddushin. That would be the logic why would only be Kiddushin. However, some others see it differently, and the way that they see it is that the money of, while it's true that this is the money of Kiddushin, she already has a connection to him by virtue of the fact that she is the Amma Ivriya. In other words, the Kiddushin creates the connection between this man and this woman. So if the connection is already there through this lifestyle of Amma Ivriya, where she's already in his home, she's already part of his family, so then the Yid would actually accomplish Nisun, which is the final stage. The Gemara is trying to bring a raya from a statement that was made. Now the statement has nothing which actually has to do with Yid. However, the Gemara makes a statement by saying, if we go just a little bit more than halfway down Yud Ches Mevez, the Gemara says, "V'shavin shemochra almana lekohen gadol and gusha v'chalutza lekohen hedyet." The Gemara says everybody agrees that the father can sell his daughter, who is an almana, to a kohen gadol. Now the problem over there happens to be dealing with the fact that an almana is not allowed to marry a kohen gadol. A widow cannot marry a kohen gadol. The problem just is, and that's the issue that's being dealt with over there. Now, again, I don't want to get into the whole sugi all over again, but the halacha is that Kiddushin is tofsim b'chai v'lavin, which means that a person there are restrictions on who a person is allowed to marry. A Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry a widow. He cannot marry an almana. If he does marry the widow, then the Kiddushin takes place. The Kiddushin works. It's tofes. Technically they can live together, and if they don't want to live together, they would have to have a divorce. It's a violation of a lav. However, the Kiddushin still works. So the discussion of that Gemara is that the father can technically sell his daughter, who is an almana, to a Kohen Gadol. That's the discussion over there. Now, the problem the Gemara is dealing with is how do you have a circumstance where this girl is going to be an almana? If the premise is the father is selling his daughter, who is an almana, his daughter, who is a widow, to a Kohen Gadol, how do you have such a circumstance where the daughter is going to be a widow? That was where the Gemara was discussing this yesterday. So quickly just run through it. The Shavin, everybody agrees, Shemochra Amanal Kohen Gadol, Gusha V'chlutza Kohen Hedyet, the father can sell his daughter, who is an almana, a widow, to a Kohen Gadol, or if she got divorced or had chalitza, to a regular Kohen. So the Gemara says, Hay almana hechitami. How do you have a case of almana? The Gemara says, Ilim into Kaddish Nafsha. If we're talking about a case where she went ahead and married herself off, Almana Karila, are we actually going to use the terminology of Almana? I'm sorry, I'm going, for those who walked in late, I moved back to yesterday's Amma just because it's the long, it's one sugya. I want to finish up where the Rav left off yesterday, but I want to give context to what we're discussing. So we are about, at this point, 2/3 of the way down Yud Chesam and Beis. The Gemara says, hold on, if she married herself off as a katana, why are we attributing the name almana, widow, to her? She can't marry herself off. It's child's play. Literally, it's child's play. So she's not an almana if the person she married herself off to died. Ve'ela de kitcha avia. Oh, it must be that her father actually married her off. Okay, hold on a second. Mi matzi mazbinla. Can he now go ahead and sell her? If the father actually accomplished ishus, marriage for this girl, he no longer has the right to sell her anymore. He has forfeited his right to sell her after he married her off. So the Gemara is now trying to analyze how she became an almana, and if she did indeed become an almana, a widow, then how is there ever going to be a circumstance where everybody's going to agree the father can then sell her as an amma again? So the Gemara says we're only left with one option. Says the Gemara, we have only one option left. We are going to have to say we're talking about a scenario where the Kiddushin that took place was not that she married herself off, not that her father married her off, rather that her father sold her as an amma, and while she was an amma, while she was this maidservant, she had a Kiddushin Yiyud together with the family that she was working for. Now it follows, this is following the opinion of Rabbi Yosef Yehuda, which we're going to analyze in greater depth today. What does he say? He says, the Amar Mos Harishanos Lav the Kiddushin Nitnu. The original monetary payment that was made for her services as an Amma are not dedicated towards the Kiddushin. Now, V'iyamrit Nisuanos, so this is the point that the Gemara is focusing on. If you're going to actually tell me that Kiddushin Yiyud is tantamount, it's equal, it's equivalent to Nisuin, Kivin Shenisas Shuv Ein Levi Rishuspa. What have you accomplished by telling me that the Kiddushin that took place here was Kiddushin Yiyud? Hold on, if Kiddushin Yiyud is exactly the same thing as Nisuin, then the father still can't sell her afterwards. Ve'elamai Erison, so the Gemara says, so what are you going to say? You're going to solve this by telling me that the Kiddushin Yiyud only accomplishes Erison? So let's look at this. V'shavin Shemochra. Everybody agrees that she can be sold. Hold on a second. What's the difference if it does Erison or it does Kiddushin? The bottom line is she's married. So now how could the father go ahead and sell her afterwards? What are you going to tell me? No, there's a difference. Shani Erison dida, me Erison davia. There's different types of Erison. An Erison that she does by herself, that's one thing. An Erison that her father does is something else. Now hold on a second. If that's the case, that you're differentiating between an Erison that she does by herself to the Kiddushin of Yiyud and the Erison that her father does for her by marrying her off to somebody else, once you've created that distinction in Erison, say the same thing when it comes to Nisuin. Let's read that in the Gemara. Afilu temi nisuin osa shani erisin dida shani nisuin dida nisuin du avia. This is what would generally refer to in the Gemara as memanavshach. Memanavshach means either way that you're going to go, you can have the same problem. Let's just analyze this by ourselves. We're trying to find a scenario where a father has a child who Nebuch is an almana. She's a widow. And the Gemara still says she can be sold by the father as an amma. So the Gemara is just trying to figure this out. In order to be a widow, she had to have been married. What type of marriage happened here? She's a child. Her father is still selling her as an amma. She must still be a child. So now, if she married herself off, it's worthless. She never was married, and therefore, if God forbid the husband, quote unquote, that we're talking about died, she's not an almana. She may be very sad that this person died, but she's not a halachic almana. She never was married to him. So that can't be the case. It must be talking about where the father married her off. If the father married her off, he no longer has the rights to sell her as an amma. He's forfeited that right. We discussed this yesterday. Bevigdoba, bevagdoba. Once he does that, he can no longer sell her as a shivcha. She was married. He used up his rights by marrying her off. So the Gemara says it must be talking about an in-between case. She was sold as a shivcha, as an amma, and then during her service period as an amma, she did kiddushin yiyud. The Gemara says, okay, what have we accomplished? If it does erisin, so then she was married. If it does nisuin, she was married. So how could the father now sell her again? The Gemara says, oh, there's a difference. There's different types of marriages. If yiyud accomplishes erisin, there's a difference between the erisin that she does and the erisin that her father does. The Gemara says, oh yeah, if that's the case, so then you could say that yiyud accomplishes nisuin also, and then just draw that distinction and say there's a difference between the nisuin that she does and the nisuin that her father does. What are we accomplishing by just taking out the word marriage and substituting it with yiyud? It's just the same terminology with a different language. The Gemara says, no, you're making a mistake. You can't draw the same distinction between nisuin that she does herself and nisuin that her father does as you'd say by erisin. Why? Haimai, Bishlama, erisin me erisin shani. There is a difference between the different erisins, and Rashi is not so clear. If you look at Rashi in the bottom of the page, the third to last line in Rashi, he says, De'ikala meimar av kapid. When it comes to erisin, the first stage of marriage, we can say it depends on the father. Av kapid kra. The pasuk is worried about the father. The lo lazavna basar Kiddushin. Once the father gives her over for Kiddushin, he's already used up his rights. You get one. He gave her to Kiddushin, so therefore he can't sell anymore. The kiva de hai Kiddushin lav iu avid no sin l'rishus l'mocher. Basically, Rashi is saying there is some legitimacy to saying the father only gets one piece of it. However, al nisuin min nisuin mishani, who gives you the right to differentiate from nisuin? Rashi explains the top line, and Daf Yutesam and Aleph, kiva de nisuin to oraisa ninhu. Basically, nisuin is the final stamp on a marriage. It's a biblical stamp on a marriage. You can't start saying there's this type of nisuin, that type of nisuin. If you get that rubber midoraisa stamp that says you're married, who gives you the right to start giving svaras and logical ideas why this type of nisuin yes, that type of nisuin lo? She's rubber stamped midoraisa as married. Who cares who did it or how it happened? It happened. She's married. Whereas erisin is step one in the marriage, over there we can say, let's analyze what the pasuk was trying to accomplish. The pasuk was saying the father gets one strike at it, either marriage or selling her as an amma. That would make sense. Okay, so the Gemara says, "Lo v'nachman v'yitzchak ta'amar afilu Rabbi Yosef Yehuda mos rishonos likidushin inu, but my mukim la k'Rabbi Lazar." The Gemara is just clarifying how would he be able to explain this. He explains it like Rabbi Eliezer. Ta'amar l'shvachos achar shvachos hu delo matzi mazbin la aval l'shivchos achar ishus matzi mazbin la. He's just going to have to explain that she can be sold. In other words, the father doesn't have the right to sell her twice, but he can sell her after he marries her off. So what's the maskan of the Gemara? The maskan of the Gemara is that yud accomplishes erisin, and there's a difference between erisin that she does and erisin that her father does, and therefore the Gemara has a maskana here, which is that yud, when an amma ivriya marries either her master or her master's son, that yiyud is only Kiddushin, and therefore there still would have to be nisuin afterwards to finalize the marriage, and that's the conclusion of yesterday's daf. We start this morning's daf Yutes Amud Aleph, at 5 lines from the top. Now the Gemara is going to continue analyzing the halachas of yiyud. Now, just to be clear, the pasuk writes very clearly where the concept of yiyud comes up, which is v'imra be'enei adoneh asher lo ya'ada v'hefta. So that's where the concept comes in, the idea of yiyud. The pasuk in the beginning of Mishpatim, if he doesn't want to marry her, asher lo ya'ada, it's lo with a vav, asher lo ya'ada v'hefta, so he ends up ultimately setting her free. The next pasuk says, v'im livno yi'adena, if he's going to marry her off to his son. So the pasuk is very clear that yiyud can either be that he marries her, if he wants, he can marry his son off to the Amma instead. Now the Gemara wants to know the following question. Bayrish Lakish. Sorry, it's 6 lines from the top. Mao shemiyayid adam libno katan. Can a person marry off this Amma Ivriya to his young child? And think about it. This girl's going to be young. An Amma Ivriya can only be sold if she is a katana. So he has this katana in his house, and he wants to marry off this katana to his katan son, to his young son. Don't get any ideas, but this is the idea the Gemara wants to know halachically. Can a person marry off his Amma Ivriya, who is a katana, to his son, who is a katan? What are the 2 sides of the question? Gemara says, "But no amarachmana," because like I just said to you, the pasuk says, "V'im live no yi'adena." The pasuk says, "But no amarachmana, but no kaldahu." Does any qualification work as long as he is technically his son? The pasuk doesn't say anything about what type of son. Gemara says, "V'im live no yi'adena." If he decides to marry her off to his son, technically any child is his son. So the pasuk is not clear that it has to be a gadol. Oh, Dilma, maybe beno dumidi day. Maybe the beno has to actually be equivalent to him. Mahu gadol, just like the father in this case is going to be a gadol. Af beno gadol, his son has to be a gadol as well. So the Gemara simply wants to know, when it says beno in the pasuk, does beno mean anyone who technically falls into the category of a biological son, or does beno indicate that it has to be similar to him, and he has to be a gadol? Amar Zera. Zera tries to prove this point. Tashema, he brings a raya. Come listen to my raya. Ish. Now, where is this talking about? This is talking about a completely unrelated topic in Vayikra, where the pasuk is talking about an adulterous relationship, and the pasuk says, "V'ish asher yin'af es eshes re'eyu," a person who will commit adultery with somebody else's wife. That's what the pasuk is talking about. Now, when it says that, it says prat lekatan. That means that if, just to finish the pasuk gives a death penalty to both people who are involved in this relationship. So a married woman goes ahead and has a relationship with another person. She's an eshes ish. The halacha is they are both subject to the death penalty. Now, when the pasuk says that, it says ish. An ish asher yin'af es eshes re'eyu. A man who will have this adulterous relationship with a married woman. The pasuk excludes clearly prat lekatan. This excludes a child. So if a married woman had relations with a child, that is not going to be included in that case. Asher yin'af, when the pasuk says asher yin'af es eshes re'eyu, prat leishes katan. This comes to exclude the wife of a child. Now hold on a second. If you're telling me that a child can do yiyud, if that's the case, we have now found a qualified scenario of ishus lekatan. What does this mean? Let's just try to analyze this for a second. The pasuk is telling us that if a child has an adulterous relationship with a married woman, this child is not subject to the death penalty as an adult would be. Why? What's the logic behind that? The assumption is that the child doesn't have the ability to accomplish, I'm using the word accomplish, although it's a terrible accomplishment over here, but he doesn't have the ability to accomplish a qualified act of niyuf, of znus in this case. So even though it happened, it doesn't qualify to reach the level of what would be an adulterous relationship. So that technically tells us a child is just not qualified to have ishus, to have this type of relationship. If that's the case, then how could we suggest that a person could marry off his child to the Amma Ivriya? That's what the Gemara seems to understand. The Gemara says, hold on. What you're telling me is, based off of off of our comparison to a scenario of znus, that he can't do yid. If he can't, amayit kamamayit lekra. The pasuk went out of its way to exclude a child. That obviously means we had reason to believe that it would be relevant. In other words, if the whole thing's irrelevant, because a child can't have an interaction of ishus, can't have this marital type of relationship because he's too young, why do you have to exclude him? Which is interesting, just parenthetically, Tosfos is just bothered by the whole idea of excluding a child. Children are not subject to onshin. Children don't get punished by Beis Din, or they don't get punished altogether. They have to wait till they grow up. So what's the idea? Prat lekatan, that a katan won't be subject to it. Now, the Tosfos, if you look at it right here on the page, is prat lekatan. It's a short one. He says, "V'yach b'gav katan lav bar onshinhu." Even though a child is not subject to punishments, mikol makom itzrich krala meute, you still have to have a pasuk to exclude it. To kasal kadaitach, I would have thought shehei nerag, the child would be killed. Kivan shehaisha nehereges al yado, since the woman is an adult and she would be subject to the death penalty because of him, so he's party to this. I don't want to spend too much time on this because it's already getting late, but there are some svaros to say that when there is an interaction between two people, even though if he had done this by himself, he wouldn't have been subject to the punishment. But since the action itself made her subject to a punishment, then he would be subject to the same punishment. Alternatively, some say that because he actually has the ability to derive pleasure from it, therefore he would be subject to onshin. But again, the concept over here is the pasuk clearly felt it was necessary to exclude this interaction between this child and this woman. Now, if the interaction between a child and a woman is nothing, because he's a child, so then how do you assume that it would be a good yiyud? But on the flip side, the Gemara asks, hold on a second, if I wouldn't have thought that it's anything, why do you have to exclude it? So that's where we are in the Gemara. So the Gemara says, Tishot mina demiyayid. We should be able to understand, we can deduce from here that indeed a child can do yiyud. Amar Rashi. Rashi says no. Incorrect. Hacha, what are we talking about? In this case, what's the scenario? Biyavam ben teisha shanim. When the pasuk is excluding somebody, we're talking about a yavam ben teisha shanim. What's yibam? We know yibam is when a person, Rahman al-Islam, dies without any children. A person gets married, dies without children, leaves over a wife all by herself. So there's a mitzvah for his brothers to go ahead and to perform yibam, to marry their sister-in-law. Now, what if the brother is 9 years old and 1 day? So what's the significance of being 9 years old? He's not a gadol. However, generally speaking, a 9-year-old has a mature enough body to be able to accomplish what would actually be considered to be a bia. Before 9 years old, a child is not considered to be strong enough to be able to accomplish what would be considered even a valid bia. After 9, if the child were to engage in a marital relation, the relation would actually qualify as a relation, whereas before that, it's just nothing. So here it's a yavam ben teisha shanim haba al yivimto askinan, who had this relationship with his yivama. So midoraisa chazile, midoraisa, that interaction is considered to be a real interaction. Just going to quickly point out, if you look at Rashi, midoraisa chazile klomar zakukalo ba'oso bia. How does a person do the mitzvah of yibam? So the mitzvah of yibam, midoraisa, is accomplished through bia, through the marital relation. There's something called maimar, where Chazal introduced performing a regular type of Kiddushin as well. But yibam is just accomplished by way of the bia. Now, Interestingly, again, we're getting a little bit late, but there is a machlokes between Rashi and Tosfos whether or not that the bia of a child actually midoraisa is enough. But let's leave that for another time. So now the Gemara explains. So Mao the Tema, I would have thought kivim de midoraisa chazia, since midoraisa this bia would work. According to Rashi, it means all the way. According to Tosfos, it does not really mean that. In other words, it's just the havamina. That's what I would have thought. Ubi also bia, and the marital relationship between this child who is above the age of 9 and this woman technically has the halachic or the halachic definition as being a marital relation, or the bia actually works. Therefore, I would say haba'alem eschai beishas ish. I would think. And if one has that interaction, they would actually be subject to the death penalty when it comes to a married woman, Kamash Malan, that no, the Pasuk's telling you, no, it has to be an ish. So now, in other words, since when it comes to the concept of yibum, the bia of a 9-year-old child has the halachic definition as a bia, I would have thought that if a 9-year-old child has an adulterous relationship with a married woman, the halacha is that would be subject to what the pasuk says, that most yumas hano afes, that both of them are subject to misa. The pasuk says no, that's not going to be the case. Rather, ish asher yin afes eshes re'eu, only if the person who had this relationship was an ish, was an adult. Kamashmalah, that doesn't work. Okay, so Gemara says, "My avila." So what's the halacha with regard to yud of a beno katan? Tashamal, let's bring a raya. Amar Rav Evo, Amar Rav Yanai, Rav Evo, and said in the name of Rav Yanai, Ein yud ela begadol. Can't be clearer than this. Yud could only be accomplished with a child over the age of bar mitzvah. Ein yud ela midas. And yud cannot be accomplished unless the person knowingly has full knowledge of this. Gemara says, hold on a second. Tarti, you're telling me you need two things. According to Rashi, Tarti means we know that a child doesn't have das until the child is bar mitzvah. So what does this mean? The ein yid ella begadol, ein yid ella midas. It's redundant. It's exactly the same thing. It's two sides of the same coin. And Gemara says, no, it doesn't mean two things. Rather, matam ka'amar. The Gemara is giving reason, it's explaining its first line. Matam ein yid el begadol. Why is it that a person cannot perform the mitzvah of yid unless he's a gadol? Why, if he's ein yid el midas? Yid can only be accomplished if the person has das. So really, it is two sides of the same coin. The Gemara does not mean to make two different statements. Biba yisema. We can alternatively say, my midas, not that it's two sides of the same coin, rather, what does that mean? Midas dida. There's two sides to this. Ein yid el begadol means that the boy performing the mitzvah of yid needs to be a gadol, needs to be above the age of bar mitzvah. The second line of ein yid el midas is not referring to the boy in this case, it's referring to the amma, which means she needs to consent to it. Midas dida, it's her own acknowledgement of this yid. The Tanya Abaya, for Abaya learned, the Tanya Abaya breder Ravo, Abaya, the son of Ravo, taught us, Asher lo ya'ada, when the pasuk says Asher lo ya'ada, malamet shetzarach li ya'ada. It's a little bit of a play on words. Li ya'ada really is used to mean in this case, deya, to understand. She has to actually know about it. She can't just be told one morning, oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, last night I married you off to my son. It has to be that she is going to be giving her consent and her das for this. Hu tanila, hu amar la. He went ahead and he taught this to us, and he explained that Kiddushin yid, this is referring to Kiddushin yid, Valibad Rabbi Yosef Yehuda, it follows the logic of Rabbi Yosef Yehuda. The Gemara is going to explain why you need the logic of Rabbi Yosef Yehuda. We'll explain this. We'll first read it inside, then we'll explain it outside. Damar Mos Harishonos Lav the Kiddushin Nitnu. We mentioned this earlier this morning. Rabbi Yosef Yehuda is of the opinion that the initial financial payment that's made for the service of the Aryeh is not designated to actually accomplish the Yiyud later on, the Kiddushin later on. And what does this mean? In other words, if the original money that was given towards Kiddushin, So essentially, the Kiddushin is done. We're just waiting for the action of the marriage to take place. So why do you have to inform her about it? It was done. It was done at the time of the sale. So it must be, if we're saying that you need to have her das, then we're following the opinion of Rav Yosef Yehuda, who says that no, the initial financial payment that was made is just for the service of Alma Ivriya. If you like to make this transfer in the middle, where she changes from being your Alma Ivriya to being your wife, you have to discuss it with her, and then at that point in time, you can make that transition from an Alma Ivriya relationship to a marital relationship. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, "Afilu temeli Kiddushin itnu." You can say that you could say this halacha even if the initial payment that was made for her service was intended for the Kiddushin. Shani hachad amar Rachmana yiada. Even though logically it doesn't make sense, but that's what the pasuk says. The pasuk says she has to know about it. So even though the original payment was made, and that payment includes the marriage, nevertheless, she has to know about it. My Rabbi Yosef Yehuda, the Gemara now says, who is this Rabbi Yosef Yehuda? We keep quoting this Rabbi Yosef Yehuda, who talks about the initial monetary payment, whether that monetary payment was to include the Kiddushin later on or not. So who is he? Tanya. The Gemara says, here he is. Here's the Brisa. It says, Ye'ada vehefta. The pasuk says, Asher lo ye'ada vehefta. Those two words, Ya'ada and Behefta, are juxtaposed. They're right next to each other. So therefore, Tzarach Shiehei Shahos Beyom Kedei Pedia. According to Rabbi Yosef Yehuda, there needs to be enough time left within her service as Alma Ivriya that technically, if she wants, she can still redeem herself. We learned previously in this Pesachta about the concept of Gira in Kesef, which is that you can prorate the sale, and if at any point in time she wants to be redeemed from her Alma Ivriya status, you prorate it and she just buys herself out. So what he's saying is, if there's still time left within her service, that she can work. And he explains, Mikan Amar Rabbi Yehuda, the first wide line, Im yesh shaus bayom, k'dei lasos imo shavar pruta mekudeshes, v'im lav eina mekudeshes. If there still is enough time left within her service time to be able to do a pruta worth of service, then the Kiddushin works. If she has already exhausted all that time, she's expired, there's not enough time left within her service to be able to provide a pruta worth of service to her master, then he can no longer marry her. Now, why is that? Alma kasavar moas harishonos lav Kiddushin itnu. It must be that he's understanding that if there is no monetary value left in her service, there's no money left to transfer as the Kiddushin. So therefore, that logically means that the initial payment that was made at the beginning of her service is not able to be designated as Kiddushin. You have to reassign the money at a later point in time to be Kiddushin. If there's no time left, so then the Kiddushin won't work. So that clearly seems to indicate that according to Rabbi Yosef Yehuda, the initial payment that's made for her service is only for the service of the maidservant. If you'd like to marry her, he has to do some type of internal transfer to say, the money that's left that I paid for your service as an Alma Ivriya should now be transferred as money for Kiddushin. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yosef Yehuda. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak disagrees. One can still say that the initial payment that was made is intended to work for Kiddushin. However, Shani Hachad Amar Krav Hefta. You know why? It has to be that there has to be enough time left that she can technically be redeemed, because that's what the pasuk says. The pasuk says, Asher lo ya'ada v'hefta. So there's some type of link between her ability to be able to accomplish, to perform yud, that she has to be technically eligible for a pedia, for a redemption. So it's not clear, it's not 100% irrefutable that the reason for Rabbi Yosef Yehuda's ruling is because the initial payment is not for Kiddushin, but that's the simple way of understanding it. Nachman Bar Yitzchak says no, that's not the case. It's just Xeris HaKasav, that in order for the yid to work, to be connected to the initial payment, it has to be that there's still enough time left so you can transfer the value of her service to then being her Kiddushin. The Gemara continues the fourth wide line at the two dots on Yutes Amar Aleph. Amar Rava, Amar of Nachman. Rava said the name of Nachman. Amar Adam L'Bito Ketana. A person could tell his young daughter, so she's below the age of Bas Mitzvah, Tzi'i, go out, V'kabli Kiddushech, and go ahead and accept your own Kiddushin for yourself. And where does he know this from? Mid Rabbi Yehuda. He learns this from the halacha of Rabbi Yehuda. Lav Amar Rabbi Yehuda has Rabbi Yehuda not taught us? Most how you shown us lav the Kiddushin it knew. Didn't he tell us that the initial payment that the father accepted is not intended for Kiddushin? Now, if that's the case, and she's still an Amma Ivriya, let's just quickly review. An Amma Ivriya only lasts as long as she's a child. Once she becomes a halachic adult, she's out. So now, the father sells her as an Amma Ivriya. She's still serving as an Amma Ivriya. That means that she's a child. Now, the payment that the father accepted for her service is not Kiddushin. Still, according to Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, she can get married to her Adam, to her master. So the Gemara says, the initial payment is lav the Kiddushin. V'chi mishayer shava pruta have a Kiddushin. If she still has a pruta worth of service left, it's Kiddushin. Achanami loshna. In other words, when she's now within the service, she's accepting Kiddushin from the money that's left. So says the Gemara, from here we can deduce that a father has the right to tell his daughter, while she's a katana, go accept money for Kiddushin. She could do this on her own. In other words, technically under normal circumstances, a child can't perform any kind of kinyan. If the father gives her the right to get married, then he wants to say that based off of the concept of Amma Ivriya getting married on the account of the money that's left within her service, that would be enough to prove that she can go ahead and accept Kiddushin on her own. V'amar Rava, Amar of Nachman, a Mekadosh b'milva, a person goes ahead is Mekadosh b'milva sheish lov mashkin. So I don't want to get into the sugi of Mekadosh b'milva again, but very quickly, in order for Kiddushin to be accomplished, there needs to actually be some type of transfer of money. Just simply for giving a loan is not enough. But a milva sheish lov mashkin, a loan that has a collateral, that's enough. Because there's actually something that's being given. There's a tangible item that's being given in this case. So now, he says, a person is mekadesh a woman with a loan that has a collateral, mikudeshes. It's going to work. How do we know that? I learned that from Rabbi Yehuda. Why? Because where do we see this from? Lav Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Didn't Rabbi Yehuda teach us? Mos harishonos lav Kiddushin. The initial payment that's made for the Amar Ria service is not intended for Kiddushin. So therefore, all the money that was paid, hay halvahi, it's all a loan. It was lent because she's still there. Vihi gufa, what is she? She's a mashkon. Again, the money is paid in advance for her service. That's a loan. What is she? She's there as a collateral to back it up. Now she gets married. V'gufa mashkon. Gemara turns the page. Yutasim beis. V'chi mishayir b'shava pruta. When there is a shava pruta left within that loan, umiyayid have a Kiddushin. They do yid, it's a Kiddushin. So this is an exact parallel. The money is paid in advance as a loan. She is the collateral. When that money is forgiven, she gets married. So we see clearly that Mekadesh Milva Sheish Lov Mashkin, a person, is Mekadesh, a woman, with a loan that has a collateral. It's going to be a good Kiddushin. Achanami lo shna, it's going to be a good proof. Ton Rabbanan. We have to go through this Amud pretty quickly, so we'll just give a quick introduction to what happens on this Amud. Like this, we're able to do this at a decent pace. We only have 10 minutes left. The Gemara is going to bring a number of halachos and then use the terminology of mashal. Generally speaking, when we use the terminology of mashal, a mashal is a parable which makes a more difficult case easier to understand. So if I'm explaining a complex idea, I might want to illustrate that idea by bringing out a very simple parable or an analogy to that case. In our Gemara, all these mishalim that are going to come up really don't mean that type of parable. Rather, it means it's like mishel. We are extracting from something to teach us a halacha to another case. Let's see how this goes. Tan Rabbanan. Ketzah mitzvahs yiyud. How does mitzvah of yiyud work? Omer Allah b'fnei shnayim. The person who's performing yiyud tells the Alma Ivriya in front of two people, Hareat mekudeshas li, Hareat meuresas li, afilu b'sov sheish, afilu samach cheshkia sachama. He tells her, you're going to be married to me, even if it is at the end of those 6 years, and even if it's right before sunset on the last day of the 6 years. Once he says Hareat mekudeshas li or Hareat meuresas li, he then transfers his relationship from her to being a marital relationship. She is no longer going to have a relationship with him as a shifcha, as a servant. Rather, it is a relationship as a husband and wife. Rabbi Yehuda says, if there is enough time left in the day that she can perform work that's worth a pruta mekudeshes, then lav eina mekudeshes, and if not, then it's too late. He has waited too long, and therefore he can't just say mekudeshes. He would have to do a full Kiddushin by giving her a new payment of money, or kesef, or shtar rupiah. Mashal, the Gemara says, mashal. This is what's the mashal of this case is la'omer liisha. It is similar to a case where a person says to a woman, "Hiskachi li me'achshav." You should be married to me from today. But when should it take effect? La'achar shloshim yom. So, in other words, the marriage should take effect today, but not yet. The marriage should start today, only in 30 days. So in 30 days from now, retroactively today, we're going to be married. Now, somebody else showed up during that period of 30 days. What's the halacha? She's married to the first guy. The Gemara says, hold on a second. Mashal Laman. Which one of the opinions in the Gemara are we extracting this halacha from? Ilema Mishal. Mashal Rabbi Yehuda, you're pulling this out from Rabbi Yehuda. Hold on. He's actually the one who put a little condition in here. He said it depends how much time is left. So why are we learning this from him? So the Gemara says, Amar Vacha Breidarava, no, Mashal Rabbanan. It's going to the opinion of the Rabbanan that says even if there's only like a minute left before Shkia Sachama, it's going to work. So that indeed shows that the first Kiddushin works. Hold on a second. The Gemara says Pshita. So why do you have to actually compare these two cases? They're exactly the same. The Gemara says, I would have thought, when we're talking about the Kiddushin of Yiyud, when that initial financial payment was made. He never said, here, I'm buying you as an Amma Ivriya, and you're going to be married to me me'achshav at the time that I decide to say that we're going to be married. So Kamash Malan, just to quickly look at Rashi to understand the way that this works, the Gemara says, Ma'u D'Tema, it is about a quarter of the way down. Lo Amarle La'av Hai Adon Me'achshav. When the master bought this Amma, he didn't say to her father Me'achshav. And therefore, v'telef minei dafil lo pirish me'achshav. I would have thought that in the comparable case, even if the guy doesn't say me'achshav, rather he says, you should be married to me in 30 days, without using the word me'achshav, I would have thought that the same halakha would be true. And therefore, if a second person comes along and performs Kiddushin, the first guy gets it. Halakha is no kamashma, no. When it comes to Amma Ivriya, he does not have to say me'achshav. It happens automatically. However, when it comes to Ruvain, who says, you are married to me from today, me'achshav, after 30 days, he actually has to say the word me'achshav. Tani Idach, we learned in another brisa, Hamocher Spito, a person sells his daughter as an Amavriya, and immediately afterwards, V'halach, the kid shalacher, he went ahead and married her off to somebody else. Gemara says, Sichek ba'adon. He's made a mockery. You could laugh at the person who bought her as an Amavriya. Umikudeshes l'sheni, she's married to the second person. In other words, selling her in that case as an Amavriya was just a joke. She's now married to the second person. Divri Rabbi Yehuda, that is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Chacham disagree. No, and Ratz l'yayed miyayed. If the master wants, he indeed can marry himself to this Amavriya. Why? Because he bought her as an Amar Vriya. The Gemara says, Mashal, we're going to also pull out a comparable case. La'omer Lisha, it's like a person who tells a woman, Aryeh mekadesh li la'achar shloshim yom. You're going to be married to me after 30 days. Another person showed up during those 30 days. She's married to the second person. The Gemara says, hold on. Mashal Laman. Which one of these opinions is it Rabbi Yehuda or the Rabbanon that you're comparing the case to? If you're telling me that the mashal is compared to the Rabbanon, hold on. Amri Rabbanon and Ratz liyayid miyayid. Rabbanon say the first person gets the right to the marriage. So how are you comparing it if you're telling me the second person gets it? Ella Amar Ravach B'Rei Derava. Ravach B'Rei Derava says mashal Rabbi Yehuda. It's really a mashal to Rabbi Yehuda. The Gemara says, okay, pshita, it's exactly the same thing. Person A, in this case, let's call him Ruvain. Ruvain says, Aryeh mekadesh asli, after 30 days. The master is going to be Ruvain in this case also. He buys her as an Amma, and then another person comes and performs Kiddushin in either case. It's exactly the same. The cases are exactly comparable, and the second person gets it. Gemara says, now the time I would have thought, Halo Amar la'achar shloshim yom. I would have said, but when it comes to the case of the master, he didn't say the at la'achar shloshim yom. Just was self-understood. You have to wait until he says he wants to do yid. So kamash malan, that's exactly the same. Tani yidach. We have another brisa. Hamocher is bito. Person sells his daughter pasak, and he makes up al manas shaloli yayed. I'm selling her to you as an amma, but the condition is I don't want you marrying her. I'm willing to send her for the work, but you can't marry my daughter. What's the halacha? Neskayim atnai. Divi Rabbi Meir. According to Rabbi Meir, the Tanai works, the condition works, and he's not allowed to perform yid with her. Chachamim say no. The condition does not take effect. He's allowed to perform yid. He can get married if he wants. Why? He made a Tanai, which is against what the Torah says. The Torah says he can marry her. You're saying you can't marry her. Sorry, sir, you don't get to make your own rules. The Torah talks to us about how the sale of an Amma Vriya works, and he cannot go ahead and change it. The Gemara says, to know about anybody makes the Tanai, conditioning what the Torah says, the Tanai, the condition is going to be batal. Hold on a second. The Meir, Gemara asks, Tanai Kayam, are you telling me that his Tanai is going to work? But Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, person says to a woman, you're going to be in person goes to a woman and says, listen, I'd like to marry you, but I want to let you know I'm not going to financially support you, I'm not going to give you clothing, we're not going to be intimate. The halacha is the Kiddushin works, it's not batal. The Torah doesn't work. She doesn't have the right to make such a condition. The Torah says marriage includes sherksus fa'ona. Who says that actually? Rabbi Meir. It's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir himself says you can't make a Tanai. When it comes to things that the Torah says very clearly. If she wants, she could actually forfeit the monetary obligation. However, when it comes to Ona, the physical relationship, she can't forfeit that. So now, how are we going to say that a person, that according to Rabbi Meir, the Tanai works, that if a person says, I'm selling you my daughter, but I don't let you do Yibum. Sorry, I don't let you do Yiyud. It's different. The pasuk over here says La'ama very clearly. So when it's sold as an Amma, the Torah actually allows you to sell a girl sometimes specifically as an Amma. Rabbanon, Rabbanon, they obviously say you can't make such a condition. But it says La'ama. They need this for the following brisa, which is La'ama. The pasuk says La'ama malamit shmach l'psulim. She's allowed to be sold to someone who's pasal. We learned earlier in the Masechta that if there's something which says you can't, that the yiyud can't take place, then the sale doesn't work. We're learning from here that she can be sold to someone who is pasal, who's not a qualified marriage. The Gemara says, hold on, you know what? I don't want to run through this so quickly. Let's stop here, and Mr. Hashem, tomorrow we'll continue from here to explain this Gemara. I'm sorry I'm leaving you off on a cliffhanger in the middle of the Gemara. We'll have to stop here. We'll continue from here, and Mr. Hashem, tomorrow. Have a wonderful Shabbos.